Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting and to some of the worst disasters in history. In this video, we're going to go over two disasters that are incredibly similar but had very different outcomes because of a single person involved. And in particular, in the second story, despite doing everything right, the people couldn't have known that something horrific was waiting for them anyway. This would go on to be so significant that it resulted in procedure changes that are still done hundreds of years later. So as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Originally built in 1793, the HMS Tribune already had quite a history by the time it joined the British Royal Navy in September of 1797. The Tribune was actually built by the French and joined the country's fleet during the French Revolutionary Wars. Midway through 1796, the ship was one of several warships navigating the Irish Isles of Sicily, and on June 8th, the flotilla was spotted by two British ships which began to chase the French ships. The Tribune then desperately tried to escape the British, but after a 10-hour intense chase, the British ships proved to be superior. The Tribune was then hit with a barrage from the British guns, which destroyed most of its mass and essentially disabled it. This forced it to surrender, and after which it was promptly captured. 2 days after it was captured, a crew boarded the ship and sailed it to Portsmouth shipyards for refitting. It took some time, but by April 29, 1797, it was officially a functional British ship. Later that same year, the HMS Tribune was assigned to a convoy to escort resupply ships to Quebec and Newfoundland under the command of Captain Scory Barker. It then departed from the town of Torquay near the southern tip of England, and the HMS Tribune and the convoy began their trip westward on September 22, 1797. About 12 days out from Halifax, however, the Tribune began to lag behind and eventually lost sight of the rest of the convoy. Undeterred by this development, Scory continued on toward Halifax, hoping to catch up with the rest of the ships. That wouldn't end up happening, but the Tribune did make it just outside of Halifax Harbor on November 16th. Now, getting into Halifax Harbor at the time was a tricky prospect. It required experience, an intimate knowledge of the coastal terrain, and a strong understanding of the currents in the channel. So it was actually customary at the time to wait outside the approach for a pilot with those credentials to board the ship and take it into port. Scory, being the seasoned captain that he was, ordered the ship to anchor briefly so that a local pilot could do this, but as this was happening, the ship's master, John Clegg, approached his captain. Clegg then assured Scory that he had the proper experience in Halifax Harbor to navigate it himself. To prove this, he cited a 44-gun ship he successfully piloted in during a voyage in the past, and a strong familiarity with the challenges the harbor presented. Additionally, he pointed out that the winds at the time were favorable and that another officer, John Cosey, could assist since he had once lived in the area. Against his better judgment, the captain was convinced by the argument that Clegg presented and came to believe that he could handle docking the Tribune. So, leaving Clegg to his duties, Scory left the wheel and went below deck to gather up some paperwork he planned to take ashore. Clegg then grabbed the wheel under the watchful eye of Cosey and began giving orders to crewmen as the captain made his way to his quarters. Already around noon though, things began to get out of hand as the ship made its way toward the southern tip of McNabb's Island and a rocky outcropping known as Thrumcap Shoals. In sudden need of help on deck, Clegg ordered the master's mate, a man history knows only by the name Mr. Galvin, topside to assist. Galvin was battling an illness at the time, but he rushed to the deck as fast as his weakened state would allow and immediately noticed the frantic work of the crew to turn the ship away from the shoals. As Clegg steered the ship away from the wind, Galvin climbed one of the large guns to get a better view of what lay ahead. And unfortunately, it was immediately clear that despite their best efforts, the ship wasn't turning fast enough and a collision with the rocks was imminent. By then, there was nothing anyone could do but wait for impact and pray. A moment later, the Tribune struck Thrumcap Shoals with force, immediately tearing a hole in the hull. The violent jolt sent Scory running to the deck and he began shouting at Clegg that he had lost the ship. But obviously, arguments and finger-pointing weren't going to save them from the predicament they were in. The captain then ordered that distress signals be flown, and they were quickly spotted by military posts in the area. Simultaneously, below deck, the Tribune was taking on water fast, and in hopes of prolonging the sinking process, Scory ordered that everything that wasn't bolted down be tossed into the North Atlantic. So quickly, the crew rushed to push as much heavy cargo and equipment overboard, including all of the guns, with the exception of one that could be used as a signal flare. Military vessels then rushed to coordinate a rescue and began making their way out to the sinking Tribune, but at the same time, the wind began to pick up, causing many of them to abort the mission. For the next 9 hours, the Tribune was stuck on the rocks of Thrumcap Shoals, but the lightening of the load by throwing as much as they could into the ocean caused the ship to begin swaying in the rough waves. Around 9 p.m., this resulted in the Tribune finally dislodging from the rocks, setting adrift off the coast of McNabb's Island. As all of this was going on, and from the moment the Tribune slammed into the shoals, the crew below deck worked tirelessly to pump the incoming water back out of the ship, and the effort was actually starting to pay off. Unfortunately, in just a little while, this would all be for nothing. Just about the time the HMS Tribune broke free from the rocks, a stronger gale force wind blew in and forcefully pushed the ship to the western shore of the harbor and slammed it into the coastal rocks. This second impact would be a costly one. Not only did it worsen the holes leaking water into the hull, it completely destroyed the ship's rudder, ultimately disabling the ship completely. And even worse, unlike the first crash, the ship didn't catch on the rocks. If it had, the passengers and crew aboard could have made it to the shore safely, but instead the ship bounced off the rocks and began drifting aimlessly near the entrance to Halifax Harbor. And by then, the time for those aboard to attempt to disembark the ship had come and gone. During the 9 hours they were stuck on Thrumcap Shoals, Scory could have ordered everyone to abandon the ship for the safety of McNabb's Island, but that never happened, and the reason for this was anything but admirable. At the time, a captain calling abandoned ship was so looked down upon by the Royal Navy that it was essentially the end of an officer's career. So had Scory issued the order, he might have saved everyone on board the ship, but that wouldn't have mattered to Royal Navy officials, and he would have never been given command of a vessel again. This self-absorbed decision would have disastrous consequences throughout the entire ordeal. After the second collision with the shore, the Tribune drifted in place only about 3 lengths from the shoreline, but the incoming gale had stirred up the ocean so much that swimming there was not possible. The waves also prevented other ships in the area that could make it out of the harbor from safely pulling alongside the Tribune. Somehow in the chaos, 2 lieutenants defied orders and managed to hop into one of the ship's smaller boats and make it to the shore, but upwards of 287 passengers and crew abided by Scory's orders to stay on board. Then, finally around 10:30 that night, the Tribune succumbed to the rising level of water in the hull. Just off Heron Cove, Nova Scotia, it tilted to one side and quickly disappeared into the North Atlantic. Now, because the ship had come to rest in the relatively shallow water just off the coast, much of the ship's rigging remained above the surface and there was a mad race to grab a hold of it. About 100 survivors managed to cling to this while the rest drifted into the ocean, fighting a losing battle to stay afloat in the violent waves. And eventually, those who couldn't find a place to hold on were washed out to sea and lost. Even many of the passengers and crew that did find refuge didn't stay there for long. As the night wore on, more and more survivors lost their strength and drowned as the current carried them out to the ocean. By nightfall, locals had rushed to the coastline hoping to witness a successful rescue, and in the darkness they built several large bonfires to help any survivors find the shoreline. And in fact, the ship had gone down so close to the shore that the survivors and locals on land could have loud conversations, but every effort both in and out of the water was all in vain. The ocean was just too strong that night. As the sun rose over the eastern coast of Canada, a horrifying sight was revealed. Of the 100 or so that initially grabbed hold of the rigging, only 8 survivors remained there. It wasn't until around 11 a.m. on November 24th that a 13-year-old boy decided to board a small boat and row it out to the sunken ship. Accounts of the shipwreck refer to the boy as Joe, but his real name is lost to history. In any case, Joe made it to the wreck and took 4 of the survivors aboard his tiny boat, as that was all it could handle. Once aboard, the 4 men collapsed in complete exhaustion from their battle to stay on the wreck all night. They were apparently so tired that they were begging for things to be over as Joe rowed them to the shore. As the morning wore on and the weather calmed, other boats were finally able to make attempts to rescue the last 4 from the wreck, which were successful. In the aftermath, because of the poorly kept logbook, the official number of passengers, crew, and officers aboard the HMS Tribune that night varied depending on accounts. It's generally agreed upon that between 250 and 289 people were on the ship, and of those aboard, only 12 survived, although some accounts suggest the number is 14. This would put the death toll at anywhere between 236 and 275 people, including Scory, Clegg, Cosi, and Galvin. The sinking of the HMS Tribune remains the worst maritime disaster to ever occur in Halifax Harbor, and the ship still lies below the ocean just off the coast to this day. In the early 1840s, the British Royal Navy began constructing what would become one of the first ever iron-hulled ships, originally named the HMS Vulcan. This ship was initially designed as a frigate, which is a type of warship that looks like traditional sailing vessels, but the plan for the ship changed before it was completed. At the time, shipbuilding was transitioning from sail power to steam engines, and the HMS Vulcan was built with large paddle wheels for propulsion. However, with the rapid changes in technology, by 1845, the Royal Navy had also tested paddle wheel ships against the newer propeller-driven ships and found that propellers were far more efficient and powerful. So as a result of these changes, the HMS Vulcan was no longer suited to be a frigate as originally planned, but rather than being scrapped, the ship was repurposed instead. There was still use for an iron-hulled paddle wheel ship, so the Royal Navy converted the Vulcan into a troop ship before its construction was completed, ensuring it would still serve a vital role in the fleet. As part of all the changes, it was also redubbed the HMS Burkenhead, named after the town in which the ship was built. When it was finally complete, the HMS Burkenhead was a state-of-the-art vessel with two 564 horsepower steam engines and a hull that was 210 feet or 64 meters long. This was 20 feet longer than any other ship in its class. The interior of the ship also had 12 watertight compartments, and the exterior included 96-pound pivot guns and 4 68-pound broadside guns. Upon its completion, the ship weighed over 900 tons with an additional carrying capacity of 1,000 more for machinery and cargo. Afterward, the Burkenhead quickly gained a reputation as a heavy, robust vehicle when it was converted in 1851 and immediately proved fit for transporting the British military's most precious cargo, which were its soldiers. And despite the ship's size and weight, it was sleek and speedy in the water, as it proved a year before it was converted when it made the trip from Cape Town, South Africa to England in just 37 days. A year later, in January of 1852, the ship was under the command of Captain Robert Salmond, whose family had served in the Royal Navy since Queen Elizabeth I. On this particular sailing, it was Robert's job to deliver British, Scottish, and Irish troops to South Africa to fight in the Cape Frontier Wars, which were an intermittent conflict between the White Cape colonists and the native peoples of the Eastern Cape in South Africa. On January 5th, the ship stopped in what was then Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up more troops as well as some of the officers' wives and family members before making the long journey to Cape Town. It then docked in Simonstown, South Africa on February 23rd with some 6 soldiers and most of the women and children disembarking before taking on a load of fresh water, supplies, horses, and 35 tons of coal. It was here that Robert got his next order, which was to transport troops to Algoa Bay to the east of Cape Town as quickly as possible. So at around 6 p.m. on February 25th, the Burkenhead departed Simonstown with somewhere between 630 and 643 men, women, and children aboard. Soon after pushing off, the vessel was making good time at around 10 miles per hour. And in the interest of speed, Robert decided that the best plan to reach the nearby Algoa Bay as quickly as possible was to basically hug the South African coastline. He then had the ship stay within about 3 miles or 5 kilometers of the shore as it paddled along. And as it did, conditions couldn't have been any better for sailing. The sea was almost a flat calm and the weather was clear, which gave them perfect visibility. It was getting to be about 2 o'clock the next morning when most of the ship's passengers were asleep or in their rooms for the night. The only stirring came from the deck, where the duty crew was wide awake navigating the ship. And since the Burkenhead was sailing close to the shoreline, frequent measurements were taken to ensure there was adequate depth for the ship's massive hull. This is known as sounding, and water depth is measured in a unit called fathoms. Every 1 fathom is equal to 6 feet or just under 2 meters. As they were doing this, the man on deck took a measurement and called out 12 fathoms, which is about 72 feet or 22 meters, which was plenty of depth for the HMS Burkenhead to travel comfortably without the threat of scraping the bottom. What the duty crew didn't know, however, was that they were heading straight for a notoriously shallow area known as Danger Point near Gons Bay off the Western Cape. In this area, there's a large, jagged boulder that sits just beneath the surface of the water. And ironically, if the seas that night had been even the slightest bit choppy, the men in the crow's nest would have spotted it and the ship could have easily navigated around it. With the ocean water as still as glass that night though, there was nothing to indicate that it was there. So just as the lead man was about to take another measurement, the bow struck the rock at Danger Point, which shredded the hull like a can opener. Almost instantly, the rock took the depth from a roomy 12 fathoms down to just 2, and the sliced up hull immediately began flooding water into the lower compartments, which included the crew and passenger quarters. In fact, many of those asleep in the bow section didn't even have a moment to get out of their hammocks and attempt to save themselves, as they were so quickly overcome by the rushing seawater. This would result in more than 100 people being drowned without ever having left their quarters. For those near the stern of the ship, there was enough time to be jostled awake by the collision and rushed up to the deck. Robert then pulled on his military coat as he made his way up topside and was quickly briefed on what had occurred. And upon hearing what happened, his first orders were to drop the anchor, prepare the lifeboats, and reverse the engines. As he gave these instructions, more and more surviving officers and soldiers were making their way onto the deck. Some of them were still in their night clothes, while others had no time to dress at all and were left standing completely naked. Of the survivors as well, most of them had suffered injuries of varying degrees from the collision with the rock. As this was all happening, the next few moments presented an interesting balance of power aboard the ship. While Robert was the captain of the Burkenhead, he had little authority over the military personnel on board, which consisted of troops from 10 different regiments. That charge went to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Seton, who immediately jumped to his command. While the troops were gathering on deck, Alexander gathered all his officers and made one thing perfectly and abundantly clear. The men, many of which were inexperienced and untested soldiers, must be kept in order and exhibit strict discipline throughout the coming ordeal. Nothing less would be accepted by their commanding officer. In the face of such a life-threatening situation, it might seem like panic would overcome everyone on board, but with this order coming from someone like Alexander, it was easy for officers and their subordinates to follow. He was born in 1814 and he showed immense promise from early on. He was educated at home for the first 15 years of his life and quickly proved to possess intelligence at a genius level. He studied mathematics and chemistry, far more advanced than his age, and he was so prolific that he was sent to Italy to learn under a renowned professor in the subjects in his early teenage years. And beyond that, he seemed to excel at everything he would go on to try. He later fell in love with art, literature, and poetry and became skilled in sketching, painting, and composing music. But maybe most incredibly, before he had even turned 18 years old, he had demonstrated complete mastery over 15 different languages, quickly surpassing the knowledge and fluency held by his Latin, Greek, and French tutors. He apparently even learned the dead language Sanskrit with ease. And somehow, despite all these incredible accomplishments, Alexander was more known for what a gentleman he was. While the military exists within a system of classes and ranks, Alexander treated all the men under his command with utmost respect and grace. Essentially, Alexander was one of the most scholarly, intelligent, and respected men, not just in the British military, but in the whole of the British Empire. Anyways, back aboard the quickly sinking Burkenhead, while Alexander's officers were gathering the troops on each side of the stern, distress rockets were fired into the air, but sadly, there were no vessels in the area that could come to its immediate aid. Robert then met with Alexander and requested about 60 of his men head to the chain pumps, which could help remove water from the ship, and another 60 further assist with deploying the lifeboats. When these second 60 began their duties in lowering the boats, however, they made a terrifying discovery. Whoever had painted the Burkenhead had excessively done so over the winches that lowered and raised the lifeboats, causing most of them to be completely stuck. So of all of the lifeboats on board, the crew and military personnel could only manage to get 4 of them in immediate working order. Then, even worse, as soon as one of them touched the water, it was overcome and quickly sank, leaving more than 630 people with just 3 boats, with a maximum capacity of just 150 people. Also on deck with the troops were the officers' families that were aboard, which included frightened women and children. Upon seeing this, Alexander drew his sword and cleared the way for all of the women and children to make their way onto a small clipper lifeboat. Once aboard, he assigned Ensign Alexander Russell to board the boat and guide it away from the sinking Bergenhead to ensure that all the women and children would remain safe. And unfortunately, although he couldn't know it at the time, the decision by Robert to throw the engines into reverse only caused the ship's hull to split even more, and quickly the engine rooms had completely flooded. So suddenly, the ship lurched forward once again, striking the same rock again. This second impact, which came only about 10 minutes after the first, then split the ship in two, and in the blink of an eye, the bow section completely sank. By then, nearly all the military personnel were standing on the deck of the stern in lines and at attention, and they all must have known that within the next few minutes, they'd be in the water. Any of them that were still below deck were freeing the horses and forcing them into the water in hopes that they'd be able to swim to shore. Once they were also back on deck too, Robert shouted command that all the men abandon ship and make their way to the 3 lifeboats. Upon hearing this though, Alexander drew his sword once again and screamed an order to his men to stand fast. After he gave this order, only 3 of the more than 400 men disobeyed his command and leapt from the ship. The rest did as they were told, and the sinking stern continued to go down. As this was happening, one of the young and inexperienced military men approached Alexander and shook his hand, telling them that he looks forward to seeing him on the shore. Alexander then eagerly took his hand, looked him in his eye, and told him that he was afraid that wouldn't be possible because he didn't know how to swim. This would be the final exchange the exceptional military officer would have. Just minutes later, the only signs of the HMS Burkenhead that remained above the water were parts of the topmast and a portion of the sailcloth. Upon the sinking of the stern, the women in the small clipper lifeboat shouted in terror as their husbands were now left at the mercy of the sea. About 50 of the men clung to the topmast, while the others did their best to tread water, but many of them, like their commanding officer, didn't know how to swim and quickly drowned. And horrifyingly, others were seen being pulled under instantly by the great white sharks that had come into the area to feed. Upon seeing this, the women on the clipper begged Ensign Russell to row the boat over to where the men were struggling in the water, and despite his orders to remain far away from the ship to prevent any of the men from swamping the boat, he began turning it back toward the wreck. As this was going on, one of the children spotted their father in the water and shouted for him to swim to the boat, but the officer refused because of the orders he received from his commanding officer. Ensign Russell then had a decision to make, and he wasted no time determining what to do next. He then stood up in the boat and leapt over the side, becoming submerged the moment he hit the water. When he breached the surface, he started to swim toward the child's father to help him toward the boat, but after only about 20 strokes, he disappeared below the water and was never seen again as the sharks dragged him under. The lifeboat was at capacity, so had Ensign Russell been successful in getting the officer on board, he would have been trading places with him, but tragically, the 19-year-old ensign's sacrifice was for nothing. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster and in all of the chaos, some of the men did actually manage to swim the 3 miles or 5 kilometers to the safety of shore. One of the younger officers was among them, and when he arrived along the rocky coast, his cavalry horse was standing there waiting for him. Of the 9 horses on board, 8 would survive, with the only casualty being the one that broke its leg when it was pushed into the water. Sometime later, as the sun rose after the tragic incident, one of the lifeboats came across a schooner called the Lioness, which brought all the lifeboat's occupants on board. Afterward, it sailed in the direction of the wreck site, where it arrived that afternoon and saved another 40 men clinging to the topmast of the HMS Burkenhead. When the survivors were all accounted for on land, only 193 of more than 630 lived to tell the disaster. Of them were the 113 soldiers, 6 Royal Marines, 54 crewmen, 7 women, 13 children, and at least 1 male civilian. Some of these figures, however, are unconfirmed, as the muster rolls and logbook went down with the ship. In the aftermath as well, word of the sinking got out quickly and captured the attention of the British public. On May 8, 1852, many of the military personnel aboard were called before a court-martial aboard the HMS Victory in Portsmouth, England. Initially, it was believed that there was going to be plenty of blame to go around, but as witnesses among the military officers and troops testified, a story of unwavering bravery began to take form. A military captain told the judges that he had never seen a better display of discipline, particularly from the soldiers of such little service experience. He would go on to say that there wasn't so much as a, quote, murmur or cry among them until the ship made her final plunge. All received their orders and carried them out as if they were embarking instead of going to the bottom, end quote. He also added that he'd never seen, quote, any embarkation conducted with so little noise or confusion, end quote. The credit for this is owed to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Seton and the fierce loyalty of the men he commanded. The impact the sinking of the HMS Burkenhead had on the maritime community, both in and outside the military, is difficult to overstate. It's the first time in any maritime disaster that the concept of women and children first was executed during an evacuation of a sinking vessel. It's since become known as the Burkenhead drill, and it became and remains standard protocol for military, commercial, and leisure vehicles during emergencies. And in fact, the story of the men aboard the Burkenhead during its sinking was so compelling that King Frederick William IV of Prussia ordered that the story of the incident be read to the commanding officers of every regiment in his military as an example of bravery and discipline he expected of them. Several decades later, in 1895, a lighthouse was finally constructed at Danger Point to keep ships away from the rock that took down the Burkenhead. Remembrance plaques to commemorate and honor those who lost their lives in the ship have been placed at the rock on at least 2 occasions, and in 2001, another was fixed to the lighthouse itself. In the more than 170 years since the sinking, rumors have swirled that the HMS Burkenhead was carrying a secret load of treasure, which included about 3 tons worth of gold coins stored in the powder room. Attempts to salvage the coins have been made and failed, but even today, the English and South African governments have a deal in place to split any of the treasure that might one day be pulled from the wreck, which still lies on the ocean floor at Danger Point. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. And finally, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.